Okay, and so I'm back with chapter 3 of Chris Hedges' The Death of the Liberal Class, and this chapter is called Dismantling the Liberal Class. Um, and so this chapter consists of two basic elements. One, Hedges talks about World War I and how World War I changed a lot in America, and maybe in particular, it changed the relationship between the government and the people, and it changed the mentality of the people. And then the second part of the chapter has to do with how that change affected the arts in particular and the importance of the arts, broadly construed to mean theater and literature and poetry and all these different elements, including the visual arts. I think this chapter probably had the most effect on me because I really had never understood the importance of the arts for politics. I never even really thought about it, I guess is what I'm saying. Um, so to me, that's a real big contribution of this chapter. Not to mention, he just goes into a lot of history on both World War I and, um, government involvement in the arts. And so you learn a lot from this chapter. But why World War One? Well, World War One was this war that was touted as, when we got into it by Woodrow Wilson, as a war to end all wars. It was supposed to be, a war that would allow the United States to have, to basically, in victory, implant this vision of world peace. The idea that I think that technology had gotten so deadly that now we had a reason to come together after the war and cooperate in the League of Nations. And so Hedges says towards the beginning of this chapter, just as ominously, the war unleashed new radical forms of mass propaganda and mass manipulation that made it possible to engineer public opinion through the technological innovations of radio, cinema, photography, and cheap mass publications and graphic art. Mass propaganda astutely exploited the new understanding of mass psychology led by thinkers such as Gustave Le Bon. Now, he's saying a lot right there, but basically, with World War I, you got this sloganeering, this idea that war was about something far greater than just, nations pitted against each other and which one would win. But it was about, massive things like peace and prosperity and cooperation and harmony. And when you think about it, that is kind of um, contradictory. And it was at a time when people had technology that they'd never had before to get the word out. Propaganda just means, information that's designed to change a lot of people's opinion. It's aimed at the level of emotion, typically. And so, now we had the technology to really have mass propaganda, um, radio, cinema, photography, mass publications that could be, generated easily. In other words, newspapers and pamphlets and things like that. And we had this understanding of psychology like never before. Now, Gustave Le Bon, he mentions, author of The Crowd, um, wrote about how when people get into crowds, their mentality changes. There were several psychologists at this time um, that people were learning from. Now, fascism's roots are partly in psychology through the irrationalism, the philosophy of irrationalism, just the idea that people, especially when they're in crowds are not rational, but rather can be guided by their emotions and instincts. And the fascists use this insight to manipulate people. And what Hedges' chapter shows here is that though you might say the United States was not a fascist country, that there's a difference there, but many of the same techniques were used and used consciously. So he says what Freud and the mass psychologists, and in turn their godchildren, the mass propagandists, had rediscovered was a deep psychological truth grasped first and perhaps best by the philosophers and rhetoricians of classical Greece. Greek philosophers did celebrate reason as nous, as a reflection of divine truth enacted in the human mind, but the Greek philosophers were trained in rhetoric before dialectics. Logical argumentation had to have a rhetorical emotional resonance if it were to sway and shape public opinion. On the Pinks of Athens, and later in the Forum of Rome, rhetors, speakers, exercised powers of persuasion that appealed to the emotions alongside the appeal to reason and fact. Well, and he goes on, but basically what he's saying there is that at this point in time, that knowledge that had accumulated of the power of rhetoric, the power of emotive public speaking, of tapping into people's primal emotions, especially in crowd, was well known and backed up by psychological theory of Freud and others like Gustave Le Bon, who had given unwittingly, perhaps you might say, the ammunition to governments to be able to more or less manipulate people's minds. So he says the war, sold with simple slogans as the war to end all wars or the war to make the world safe for democracy, did not so much emasculate intellectuals, artists, and progressives as seduce them. The enthusiastic embrace of war by many intellectuals and dissidents stunned the few stalwarts. And now this is really where the chapter takes a turn that you might think a little unpredictable. You know, why is Hedges spending so much time talking about how the artists kind of caved into the war effort, to the supporting the war? But it becomes very important because, as he points out, for the common person, this was a source of the arts, were a source of political opinion or, alternative opinion. We have TV today. They had the theater. And that television, today's programs, and has for all time since television's been in operation, there have been programs that basically make political and social statements. And so did theater, and so did painting, and even if people didn't go to them directly, well, they'd hear about them from others. In other words, the ideas would be in the air. So when the government started to realize the power of mass propaganda, then many of these things were harnessed. And so the next thing Hedges does, and I can't go into too much depth here, but interwar period, right, is when we move into the Great Depression and the need for government programs supposedly lifting people out of their economic misery. So during the Great Depression, what had started during World War I with the government beginning to figure out how to kind of send out messages to people became, the more or less the co-optation of the arts. There were programs for people in theater. And here's where I have a little bit of trouble, right? I don't think Hedges makes this argument, but I'm going to make it. So when government pays for the arts, then it can control the arts. And this is basically what happened. Now, Hedges says that, at first Many of these people in theater were hired, and they used their platform, and were supported in doing so, used their platform to kind of criticize the big tycoons and the people that had um, basically had produced a lot of the problems that led to the Great Depression. And they had exposed the corruption. But they were using basically the government's programs to do this. And then, of course, the government didn't like the messages going out from theater that were critical of the people in power, critical of government, critical of industry, and so they shut them down. So he tells this really interesting story. I'll just read bits of it here and there. He says, the mass propaganda established during World War I, the war, which included journalists, entertainers, artists, and novelists, became the model for 20th century corporate and governmental advertising and publicity. The selling of the Iraq War by the administration of George W. Bush was lifted from the playbook of the CPI, as was the tactics used by ExxonMobil to use $16 million to fund a network of 43 grassroots organizations opposed to the science of climate change. So I'm trying to find what the CPI stands for, but basically the CPI was a government program from the interwar period when we had all sorts of programs to employ people. And what Hedges is saying is that what the CPI attempted to do, controlling the arts and kind of using them for governmental purposes, and when they couldn't do that, they shut it down, became the tactics of, everything from the administration of Bush to ExxonMobil. In other words, people figured out how to mass manipulate through the arts, and Hedges argues that many of the artists were all too happy to comply, to be sort of controlled by industry as well as government, and the two are basically, in a lot of ways, going together. I mean, think about, many of us don't even really pay any attention to public television anymore, but it still exists, and public television's funded by the government, of course, but it's also, as you all know, maybe, a lot of funding comes from private industry. You watch a program on PBS, and they run this list of companies that support the program and support public television, or public radio is the same way. And it's a double-edged sword because, yes, even to this day, public television is a very mild sort of retort. They don't go along with everything, whatever the government is, especially if it's conservative, but it's very, very mild. And they know that if they get too far out of line, well, all these companies that have been supporting them, all these foundations that are supported by the companies, will just not support them. So Hedges is just, again, basically saying that this history set these folks up, that these folks, the artists, the people in theater, the actors, the directors, the authors, I mean, these are folks that are supposed to provide an intellectual critique of what's going on, that's independent and accessible to most people, either directly or indirectly. But it doesn't do that, and one of the reasons is just getting seduced by the support. But another, as he says, is the witch hunts that occurred. As the government didn't like some of the things that were being said, or corporations didn't like things that were being said, and tried to shut these people down. And of course, the ultimate one was the Red Scare and the McCarthy period, where artists and intellectuals and people in theater were accused of being communists if they had any sort of criticism. And that's a rough cross to bear, right? And to move on and try to figure out how to continue. Anyway, some people did, but I mean, it was an onslaught from a lot of different angles. And many of them, he says, simply succumbed to corporate culture and largesse. He says new desires and habits were implanted by corporate advertisers to replace the old. Individual frustrations and discontents could be solved. Corporate culture assured the populace through the wonders of consumerism and cultural homogenization. American culture or cultures were replaced with junk culture and junk politics. And now, standing on the cultural ash heap, we survey the ruin. The slogans of advertising and mass culture have become the common idiom, robbing citizens of the language to make sense of the destruction. Well, I would only say to that I mean, there's a lot of truth to what Hedges says in this chapter about how too many people have sold out and how, there's been this quite strong onslaught of attempts to make sure that truly contradictory opinions aren't heard. If you look in the right places, that's the problem, is you have to look. You find every bit as much cultural criticism and really quite thought-provoking criticism as ever. And I'll just mention one, The Handmaid's Tale on Hulu. It's a independent production. It's an original by Hulu. And it's a dystopian world in which people have become sterile largely due to environmental catastrophes and I think war and some sort of weird Mormon but like hyper on speed fundamentalist Christianity type of thing that isn't like anything quite that we have, has taken over and is extremely controlling. And that's exactly the kind of thing that Sinclair and Sinclair Lewis and Upton Sinclair were trying to do in their own literature back in the day. So I don't want to say there's absolutely nothing, but the problem is there's so many ways to be entertained these days that most people aren't exposed to The Handmaid's Tale. Back when there was public television okay, there still is, but back when public television was one of the four stations that you got, ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS, then, there was a larger percentage of the population that would be exposed to something thought-provoking that might occur on PBS. Although I must say, by the time I was on the scene as a kid, I don't remember it being very thought-provoking at that point even. But anyway, there was more of a chance that more people would be exposed to entertainment that would challenge their assumptions. Now, even though I would say there's much higher quality entertainment, and if you want to go look for serious social commentary, you will find it on Hulu, Netflix, Amazon Prime, HBO, etc. Way better, way, way better than the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. And so, people who say there's no such thing as artistic talent now, or there's no thought-provoking programming, are just flat wrong. However, the audience for each one of these is a much smaller fraction of the population than existed back when there were only 3 channels or 4 channels. Anyway, I digress. So Hedges is starting to pave the way to this argument that these folks in the arts should serve, again, the purpose of being a sort of opposition, a source of social criticism, a source of, accessible to ordinary people to help them think about their their government and their society, and that it has been A, largely destroyed by B, um, outright hostility towards them, but C, uh, because it's just so much cushier to just not do this stuff and entertain. Okay, that's his argument. I'm saying it's not quite as bad as he thinks, but that hopeful thought is mitigated by the disintegration of our entertainment so that we don't have a common experience to share. So that makes it hard for these very talented people putting together shows like The Handmaid's Tale from having the impact that they otherwise would. All right, so that's my 2 cents. I'll see you next time. Bye.